Paris at night had a way of enveloping Daniel in equal parts wonder and loneliness. He had arrived 3 months ago, a transfer student from London, chasing a degree in architecture. But what he hadn't anticipated was the overwhelming solitude that came with moving to a city renowned for its romance and charm. His small apartment near Montmartre was functional but quiet, the kind of place where thoughts grew loud enough to keep him awake. That was until Leo moved in. Leo, the French literature student, was everything Daniel wasn't. Effortlessly charismatic, with an air of mystery that made people linger just a little too long in his presence. His tousled black hair and sharp cheekbones looked like they belonged in a painting rather than real life. He had rented the spare room after replying to an ad Daniel had nervously posted online. Within days, Leo had filled the apartment with an easy warmth, hosting dinners for friends and filling the air with the scent of freshly brewed coffee. But Leo also brought tension, an undercurrent that Daniel couldn't quite ignore. They weren't close, not really, but they shared small, intimate routines that made Daniel ache for more. The way Leo would hum softly in the kitchen as he made tea late at night, or the way he'd look at Daniel sometimes, a fleeting glance that felt like it held secrets. It was enough to keep Daniel's mind turning in circles long after he crawled into bed. Tonight, though, was different. The third player in this quiet drama was Owen, Daniel's boyfriend back in London. They'd been together for 3 years, and their relationship had weathered long distance before. Owen was dependable, stable, and kind. The weekly video calls had become their lifeline, but lately, Daniel found himself dreading them. Owen's face on the screen, with its familiar smiles and reassurances, only deepened Daniel's guilt over the growing unease he couldn't admit to. As Daniel sat in the living room, sketchbook balanced on his lap, the guilt began to creep in again. He was working on a design for his class, a spiraling staircase that felt as impossible to construct as his own emotions. The TV murmured softly in the background, tuned to some French film Leo had left playing earlier. Leo wasn't home yet, and Daniel was glad. He needed the space to think, but the stillness didn't last. The sound of the front door, creaking open, startled him. Leo stepped in, shaking rain from his coat, his expression unreadable. He carried himself with the same easy confidence he always did, but tonight there was something different in his eyes, something tired, maybe even troubled. "Late night?" Daniel asked, trying to keep his voice light. Leo smiled faintly, setting his keys on the counter. "You could say that." He paused, studying Daniel for a moment. "You've been working on that for hours. When's the last time you ate?" Daniel shrugged, brushing a strand of hair from his eyes. "I lost track of time." "Of course you did," Leo said, shaking his head. He disappeared into the kitchen, and soon the comforting sound of clinking dishes and running water filled the air. It was moments like these that made Daniel's chest tighten. Leo's presence felt so natural, so effortless, that it was easy to forget the boundaries they were supposed to maintain. "Do you ever stop taking care of people?" Daniel called out, half joking. Leo returned with a plate of toast and a cup of tea, setting them down on the table beside Daniel. "You're easy to take care of," he said simply, before sinking into the chair opposite him. The room fell into a comfortable silence, broken only by the soft rustle of pages as Daniel flipped through his sketchbook. He was hyper-aware of Leo's gaze, the way it lingered on him as if trying to decipher some puzzle. "You've been quiet lately," Leo said after a while. Daniel stiffened, not expecting the observation. "Just busy avoiding something, maybe." The words were casual, but they struck a nerve. Daniel looked up sharply, meeting Leo's eyes. For a moment, the air between them felt charged, heavy with unspoken truths. "I'm not avoiding anything," Daniel lied, though his voice wavered slightly. Leo leaned back in his chair, his expression softening. "If you say so." The tension broke as quickly as it had formed, and Leo shifted the conversation to something mundane, the noisy neighbors upstairs, a new bakery he wanted to try. But Daniel could still feel the weight of what hadn't been said, lingering like a shadow in the room. Later, when Leo excused himself to shower, Daniel stayed behind in the living room, staring at the empty plate and cooling tea. He thought about Owen, about the man he'd promised to love unconditionally, and about the way Leo's presence seemed to unravel that promise with every passing day. As the hours dragged on, Daniel's eyelids grew heavy. He set his sketchbook aside and curled up on the couch, too tired to make it to his bed. The last thing he remembered before sleep claimed him was the sound of the rain against the window and the faint scent of Leo's cologne lingering in the air. Daniel awoke to the soft glow of moonlight filtering through the apartment's curtains, his senses dulled by the haze of half-sleep. For a moment, he was disoriented, unsure of where he was. Then, the faint scent of coffee and cedar reached him, grounding him in the familiar, the living room, his sketchbook still open on the table, and the quiet hum of Paris beyond the window. But something else lingered in the air, a presence. As his eyes adjusted, he realized Leo was there, standing a few feet away. The sight sent a jolt through Daniel, not of fear, but of something far more complicated. Leo was watching him, his posture uncertain, as though caught between staying and retreating. His expression was hard to read, a mixture of tenderness and hesitation. "Leo?" Daniel's voice was hoarse, his throat dry from sleep. Leo flinched slightly, caught off guard by the sudden acknowledgement. Sorry, he stammered, his usual composure replaced by something raw. "You look cold. I was going to grab a blanket." Daniel sat up, his heart pounding harder than the situation warranted. "You didn't have to do that," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Leo lingered, his gaze searching Daniel's face for something unspoken. "You work too hard," he said softly, as if it were an accusation and a compliment at once. "You don't take care of yourself." "I'm fine," Daniel replied, though the words felt hollow. The vulnerability of being caught off guard, of being seen so intimately, made him shift uncomfortably. He wanted to say more, to diffuse the moment, but the tension was suffocating. "You're not," Leo said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're so far away, even when you're right here." The comment hit harder than Daniel expected. He wanted to protest, to tell Leo he was wrong, but the truth weighed too heavily on him. He was far away, from Owen, from himself, and from the life he thought he wanted. And Leo, standing there with his piercing gaze and quiet intensity, was too close. "What do you want me to say, Leo?" Daniel asked, his voice cracking. "That I'm confused? That I don't know what I'm doing anymore?" Leo took a step closer, and Daniel's breath hitched. The space between them felt charged, like a live wire humming with potential. "You don't have to say anything," Leo murmured. "I just don't want you to pretend you're okay when you're not." The words were simple, but they unraveled something in Daniel. He was tired of pretending, tired of holding on to a version of himself that no longer felt real. The weight of it all, the distance from Owen, the magnetic pull toward Leo, the guilt, the longing, pressed down on him until he felt like he might break. And then Leo moved closer, his hand brushing against Daniel's. It was such a small gesture, but it set off a cascade of emotions that Daniel couldn't contain. He looked up, meeting Leo's gaze, and in that moment, everything else faded away. The apartment, the rain outside, even the image of Owen's face, it all dissolved into the intensity of the connection between them. "Leo," Daniel started, his voice trembling. But before he could finish, Leo leaned in, closing the space between them. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if testing the waters. Then it deepened, a surge of emotion pouring into the act. Years of longing, of suppressed feelings, of desires they could no longer ignore. Daniel's heart raced, his hands trembling as they found their way to Leo's shoulders. For a brief moment, the world felt right, as if this was where he was meant to be all along. But as quickly as the moment came, reality crashed back in. Daniel pulled away abruptly, his chest heaving. "I can't," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Leo's face fell, hurt flashing in his eyes. "Daniel, I can't," Daniel repeated, more firmly this time. He stood up, putting distance between them, his mind racing. This isn't fair. Not to Owen. Not to you. Leo looked down, his jaw tightening. Do you love him? He asked quietly, the question cutting through the air like a knife. Daniel froze, the weight of the question pressing down on him. He thought about Owen, about the years they'd spent together, the memories they'd built. But he also thought about the distance between them, the way their conversations had grown stilted, the way his heart no longer raced at the sound of Owen's voice. I don't know, Daniel admitted, his voice barely audible. The words felt like a betrayal, but they were the only truth he had. Leo nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. I'm sorry, he said, though Daniel wasn't sure what he was apologizing for. I didn't mean to make things harder for you. You didn't, Daniel said quickly, though he knew it wasn't entirely true. This is on me. I let it happen. For a moment, they stood there in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Daniel wanted to say something, to fix what felt broken, but he didn't know how. All he knew was that he couldn't stay in the room any longer. I need some air, he muttered, grabbing his coat and heading for the door. Daniel. Wait, Leo called after him, but Daniel didn't stop. He needed to think, to breathe, to figure out what the hell he was going to do. As he stepped out into the Paris night, the cool air hit him like a shock, cutting through the haze of his thoughts. He walked aimlessly, his mind a whirlwind of guilt, confusion, and longing. He thought about Owen, about Leo, about the choices he'd made and the ones he still had to make. He didn't know how he was going to face either of them, but he knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same. Daniel didn't return to the apartment until the early morning, when the streets of Paris were cloaked in a soft mist. The city was quiet, its usual vibrancy dulled by the hour, but Daniel's mind was anything but still. Every step brought him closer to the place he now associated with both comfort and chaos. When he finally unlocked the door, the apartment was dark, save for the faint glow of a lamp in the living room. Leo was sitting on the couch, his face partially obscured by his hands. At the sound of the door closing, he looked up, his expression a mixture of relief and apprehension. You didn't have to wait up, Daniel said quietly, shrugging off his coat. Leo didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood, his movements slow and deliberate. I couldn't sleep, he admitted, his voice heavy with emotion. I kept thinking about what happened, about what I said. Daniel hesitated, unsure how to navigate the minefield of feelings between them. Leo, Let me finish, Leo interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. I need to say this. He took a deep breath, his hands curling into fists at his sides. I care about you, Daniel, more than I should, but I can't keep doing this. Wondering, hoping, waiting for you to decide what you want. The words struck Daniel like a physical blow. He wanted to protest, to tell Leo that it wasn't that simple, but he knew Leo was right. He had been selfish, letting things linger in ambiguity, caught between the comfort of what he knew and the temptation of what he didn't. I don't know what I want, Daniel confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought I did. I thought I had everything figured out. Owen, my future, all of it. But now, he trailed off, shaking his head. Now, I don't even know who I am anymore. Leo stepped closer, his gaze softening. You don't have to know everything right now, he said gently. But you need to be honest with yourself, with Owen, and with me. Otherwise, we're just going to keep hurting each other. The mention of Owen sent a fresh wave of guilt crashing over Daniel. He hadn't spoken to him since the night before, when he'd ignored his calls in a haze of confusion. He couldn't avoid the conversation any longer. You're right, Daniel said finally, his voice steadier now. I need to talk to him. To Owen. It's not fair to keep stringing him along. Leo nodded, though the sadness in his eyes was unmistakable. And after that, Daniel didn't have an answer. He wanted to promise Leo something, anything, but he knew it wouldn't be fair. Not until he faced the consequences of his actions. I don't know, he admitted, the honesty cutting through the tension like a knife. But I'll figure it out. I have to. Leo held his gaze for a long moment before finally stepping back. "I hope you do," he said quietly. "Because you deserve to be happy, Daniel. And so does Owen." The weight of Leo's words lingered long after he left the room, retreating to his own space. Daniel stood there for a moment, staring at the empty couch, before pulling out his phone. His hands trembled as he dialed Owen's number, each ring amplifying the knot of dread in his chest. When Owen's voice finally came through, it was warm and familiar, a reminder of the stability Daniel had once cherished. "Hey, love. I was starting to think you'd forgotten about me," Owen said, his tone light but tinged with concern. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat tightening. "Hey," he managed, his voice cracking. I need to talk to you." There was a pause on the other end, and when Owen spoke again, his tone had shifted. "What's going on?" Daniel took a deep breath, steeling himself. "I haven't been honest with you," he began, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "About how I've been feeling, about what's been happening here." He told Owen everything, the growing distance between them, the confusion he felt, and, finally, the kiss with Leo. He didn't sugarcoat it, didn't try to justify his actions. He owed Owen that much. When he finished, the silence on the other end was deafening. Daniel closed his eyes, bracing himself for the anger, the hurt, the inevitable fallout. "I see," Owen said finally, his voice quieter than Daniel had ever heard it. "Thank you for telling me." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made Daniel's chest ache. "I'm sorry, Owen," he said, his voice breaking. "I never wanted to hurt you." "I know," Owen replied, and there was a softness in his tone that Daniel hadn't expected. "But I think we both knew something wasn't right. Maybe we've been holding on to each other because it's comfortable, not because it's what we need." Daniel felt tears prick at his eyes, the truth of Owen's words cutting deeper than he anticipated. "I don't want to lose you," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "You're not losing me," Owen said gently. "But maybe it's time we let each other go." The call ended soon after, and Daniel sat in the quiet of the living room, the weight of the conversation settling over him like a blanket. He felt raw, exposed, but also oddly relieved. For the first time in months, the path ahead, though uncertain, felt like his own. The next morning, as sunlight filtered through the curtains, Daniel found Leo in the kitchen, pouring coffee. The air between them was different now, quieter, but not as heavy. "I called Owen," Daniel said, breaking the silence. Leo looked up, his expression unreadable. "And it's over," Daniel said simply. "We both agreed it was for the best." Leo nodded, his gaze searching Daniel's face. "How do you feel?" "Honestly," Daniel said, a small, bittersweet smile tugging at his lips. "I don't know. But for the first time in a long time, I think I'm ready to figure it out." Leo didn't respond right away, but the faint smile that touched his lips was enough. It wasn't a resolution, not entirely, but it was a beginning, and for now, that was enough.